Okay, so you guys have already gone through all of chapter 5. So this is a review to remind you all what we watched, what we talked about, what you saw before the extended break. Talk a little bit about the project, and then release you guys to start working on the chapter 5 research project. So today's goal is to understand the CPU manufacturers types and how they're rated and compared. And I know you guys went through all this already on the course videos, so I'm not going to hash out everything. But if you get someplace that you're like, I didn't understand that, please stop me. Okay? Don't let me skim by something that you either forgot in the last 2 weeks because you did a brain dump or didn't understand when you watched it in the first place. Okay. So it's the function of the CPU. Okay, it's the brain. It's where most processing takes place. Where are the two other major places that processing takes place on a computer? Give me one, Dylan. Well, I just two other places where processing takes place.
Like North chipset.
Okay, so I'm going to say the chipsets. We know that some processing takes place on the chipsets, and it decides where it's going to route information around the motherboard to the CPU. There's one other place we really haven't covered it other than briefly in chapter 1, where you might have a very large amount of processing taking place on your computer, possibly. And here's my hint. Okay, your GPU or your video card. So those are the places most processing takes place. And he said GPU, so I'll write that down, the graphics processing unit, which is a subject chapter 7. Not every computer, well, every computer has some sort of GPU, but not every computer has a high-end video card inside it. Some of them are done on the motherboard, either as part of the motherboard or as part of the CPU. So we still are saying that most of the processing takes place at the CPU, but depending on what you're doing, you could have a bunch taking place on the GPU as well. Okay, so two major manufacturers of CPUs are AMD and Intel. Okay, there was another one. Been others. I had a Citrix CPU back in 1990. Gosh, what year was that? It was like 98, 99. They're gone. And theirs were really a knockoff trying to emulate an Intel anyway. Really, these are the only two CPU manufacturers left today. Intel's been around the longest. They got into the making of CPUs at the behest of Intel for this PC, IBM, this PC right here. IBM was making the first commercial consumer grade PC, the original IBM PC there, and they wanted a manufacturer to make those. Intel was already in the process because that was way before 68, but that's when they kind of blew up as the big CPU manufacturer. And it was them, Intel, that got AMD into the process back in 1982, because when those were coming out, IBM didn't want a single source of CPU chips, so they said, hey, you have to find somebody else to make CPU chips too. So Intel asked AMD to get in the process of subcontracting and making chips for them back in 1982. And a couple years later, IBM said, you know what, Intel, you're doing fine. You don't have to use AMD anymore. So Intel fired AMD, breach of contract. AMD sued Intel, and they've gotten several $1 billion from Intel over the years in lawsuits, because you can't just say, hey, make this, we build all these factories, and then, oh, never mind. So Intel created its only competitor and funded most of their research. But Intel was the number one thing. We see Intel ads on TV. We never really see AMD ads on TV. AMD doesn't do that. We still make a very good product, but we very, very rarely see AMD ads. In fact, more likely place to see AMD ads at all is on YouTube, where they're very, very targeted at the IT community, because most people don't even know that AMD is there, right? They just know that the computer has some kind of processor in it, and most of them know Intel from the commercials and stuff. Intel, this isn't all the sockets, but this is the recent, since they started making LGAs, and all of the major sockets that Intel has made are LGA sockets. And we, in our research projects, only did sockets that were made since 2017. If you did Intel, you can only do the LGA 2066, 1200, and 1700, just because we only wanted current ones. But LGA existed far further back than that. We know that the LGA stands for, Mr. Herman, what's LGA stand for? Land Grid Array. I don't know why this is called land, but it's flat, so I don't know. Maybe a flat earth person decided it was called land grid. I don't know. Land grid arrays just have these little dots on the CPU. There are no pins whatsoever on the CPU. It's very hard to damage an LGA CPU. And the LGA CPU socket just has little dimples on the motherboard to connect it to. In comparison, AMD has been making mostly PGA sockets, and only the most current ginormous sockets that AMD made are LGA. The TR4 and the STRX4, which are ginormous cards, are LGA. All the rest of theirs are PGA, and PGA stands for Pin Grid Array. Pin Grid Array as opposed to land grid array. That's because it has the pins on the bottom of the CPU. And the other class bent a couple of them. Wasn't you guys, right? Was the other class? They ruined a couple when we were last tear down to rebuild, so I had to find and order some new CPUs to replace those, because like I said in class, the downside of this CPU is if you bend a pin, it's almost impossible to get it back in. You really have to be careful. And I don't know whether they dropped it, I don't know if they pulled it out wrong, but they bent a huge row of the pins and we couldn't get them back in. So I had to order some. So next time we do the breakdown and rebuild, we're going to be using a couple new CPUs. They're eBay purchases. But that is the downside of the PGA, but most people, once they put them in, never take them out again, right? We don't usually pull them out and in like we have, so it's not that big of a deal. It also is called a ZIF socket, if you remember, for zero insertion force. The CPUs that we're going to be putting in there. Now, I don't remember. I'll have to look at my stuff, but if either you guys had to do new motherboards because you didn't pick ones with the right sockets, if you did AMD, it had to be an AM4, TR4, or an STRX4 socket, because the CPUs have to be those as well. And if you did Intel, it had to be an LGA 2066, 1200, or 1700. There were several students that had to redo some of their motherboard choices because of that, to make sure that when we did the research part of this project, we were doing the right CPUs. So if that was the case, you guys need to make sure you pick the right ones. There are lots more sockets. I'm not going to go to that. This is the Wikipedia site that is also listed on your page in the book. So when it comes to CPUs, there are different ways. First of all, the socket has nothing to do with the speed. Has nothing to do with the speed. Now, realistically, the faster CPUs are made for the newer sockets, but the socket itself has nothing to do with the speed of a CPU. You can have a AM4 CPU that's faster than a TR4 CPU, or vice versa. It has nothing to do with the age or the speed of the socket. It has to do with things we're about to talk about. Okay? So, the first thing is the speed of the processor, rated in gigahertz. your processor might be something like 3.32 gigahertz, meaning it cycles at 3.2 hertz, number of cycles per second, and giga means billion. Okay, so it cycles at 3.2 billion cycles per second. And this is how most people look at that number, and that means fast. And that is not necessarily true. You could have a 3.2 gigahertz processor that is far slower than a 4.2 gigahertz processor because it's only one part of the entire equation of how processors are rated. Okay, so that's just the thing that most people see and think of, and it's the easiest thing to compare because it's a number. I can compare 3.2 to 4.0 really easily. Okay, so the speed that it processes is one of the things that it uses to figure it out. The next thing is the number of cores. Okay, so a processor can have, and none of them have one anymore. Okay, can have 2 to 128, I think is the newest, cores on this die. Okay, so how many things underneath here can do processing at the same time? This one has 8 cores underneath this. Okay, so the number of cores means how many calculations can it do at the same time, and more cores may mean faster processing. It doesn't necessarily, because it also depends on the software you're running. Many games can't use multiple cores. They can only use one. So if I get a CPU that's 3.2 gigahertz versus one that's 4.0 gigahertz, and it can only use one core when it plays the game is going to feel faster on this one, even if the system is better on this one. So again, not a straight comparison when we're looking at things. So when we look at the number of cores, we have to think of what am I using it for? Now on my servers, which do multiple things all the time, more cores make a huge difference. On your laptop, when you may be only looking at Google Chrome or Word or PowerPoint, the 4 cores that are on those may be perfectly acceptable. Now in all cases, in my opinion, 2 cores are out the window. And one of the reasons for that is because more cores, now a single process like Word may only use 1 core. That doesn't mean Word will be fast on a 1-core machine, because you have lots of other crap going on your computer all the time. In fact, if we open Task Manager on my computer right now, to look at the number of things going on my computer right now, I've got Google Chrome open with 23. Google Chrome's a memory sucker, by the way. It's got 23 different versions of. I only have a couple tabs open. Google Chrome is running 23 processes right now. OBS Studio, which is doing the recording of this, is running 5. Smart Notebook is running 7. Then I've got Task Manager, which is what I just opened up, and I got Windows Explorer. I got an Explorer window open. Those are the apps I have open. There's another 71 background things going on right now on my computer. Okay? One of the biggest hogs on a computer can be those background processes. So in all cases, we would like, in my opinion anymore, 4 cores. Okay? Because of all this background stuff that's going on that we didn't start, just happens when I open up Windows. Okay? Now some of them do very, very little. I'm only using 3% of my total CPU usage right now. And these, look at all these background tasks. They say 0. They're not truly 0. If they were truly 0, they would not be running at all. It just means it's so low that we're going to call it 0. It's like 0.1% of my CPU being used on that one task. Oh, there it went. You just went up to 0.1. So all these things are saying 0. This one's system applications running a little bit more. Windows audio is using a little bit more. I can scroll down. In fact, if I wanted to, I could just hit up here and it would order them by who's using the most CPUs, and it keeps moving around by who's using the most CPU. Same thing with memory. Who's using the most memory? Google Chrome is using more memory, and then Notebook. You get the idea. There's lots of stuff that's going on in the background. So in some cases, cores can make a difference if you're too limited on the number of cores we've got going on. But single processes, wrong one. Single processes usually only use one core each. So there is a point, Control L, right? Yeah, okay. Where more cores are going to make a difference. The last thing when we talk about cores is computers have cores, like mine has 10 cores. I think that's a 10-core CPU, but it has 20 threads, meaning that the computer effectively acts like a 20-core machine. It's not truly 20 cores. Cores are better than threads. This is a piece of hardware, meaning it's got 10 processors on the die, on this. Where did I set it down? Don't know where I set that CPU down. I don't know where I set it down. Oh, right there. So on this one, it has 8. This one has 8 on it. So it has 8 physical cores that do processing, but those cores can each do 2 things at a time. So it's called a thread. This is not a good. This is, I'm going to call it software magic. Okay. This is good. This is better. So it used to be that AMD would lie to everyone, and they would say they had an 8-core processor. Really, they had a 4-core processor that was hyper-threaded, which means 20 threads, but they couldn't use the term hyper-thread because that was an Intel word, so they just said they had 8 cores. They all got sued. I got $8 a couple weeks ago because I was part of the class action lawsuit. They emailed me and said, "You want to be part of it?" I'm like, "Yeah, okay." Emailed back, and I got a whole, it was like $8.12 that about 1 million of us got from AMD for that lie. Now, I will tell you, I knew it was a lie when I bought it. Most people didn't know it was a lie. I knew it was really 4-core, 8-thread. But now AMD doesn't do that anymore because I got sued. Anyway, so there's a difference between cores and threads. Cores are good. Threads are okay. Better than not threaded. And then the last thing is memory. On the CPU, there is memory. This memory is far faster. We're going to talk about types of memory. This memory is far faster than the memory that the CPU can access on the motherboard for several reasons. Number one, it's right on the die. Number two, this is static and this is dynamic. Static RAM is faster and more expensive. Dynamic RAM is cheaper and slower. Okay, this has to be refreshed. The CPU writes to this RAM and it just stays there until it needs it. And it's obviously right on there. If this is a 4 gigahertz CPU, I don't have one, there we go, and this is a 2 gigahertz motherboard, this is twice as fast as this, and it has to go through something twice as slow to get to this. So RAM on the CPU, called cache, makes a CPU run effectively far faster. So you can have 2 CPUs with the same core, the same model, but different numbers of cache, and that one does things effectively way faster. 3 kinds of cache. L1 means it's on the processor, so there's a different copy of it for each processor on, or each core on the CPU. L2 means it's slightly off the processor, but it's still not shared. And L3 means it's still in here, but now all the cores share it. It's first come, first serve, whoever needs the cache memory. And most CPUs have moved to L3 cache because they can put way more on it. This cache is the unknown number that really can severely affect how fast a CPU effectively is. I talked previously about the difference between Celeron and Pentium processors. First processors I bought when I was over in Mr. Windows' room were Celerons. The second one I got were Pentiums. They were both 2.4 gig. The Celeron had 128K of cache, and the Pentiums had 512K of cache. Difference between those two was astronomical with how fast the computer ran. Processor's the same speed, but it made a huge difference. So when it comes to Intel, Celeron means low cache. Yeah, but that's what it means. Okay, so more cache always means faster processing of the computer. Okay, so this is just to explain. This might be a CPU, a 4-core CPU. L1 exists for each core if there's L1 cache listed. L2 exists for each core if there's L2 listed, but it's not on the die. And L3 is shared between all the cores if there's L3. It's still on here, but it's nanometers away from it, but it makes a difference on the overall speed of the CPU. Okay, how do we really put it all together? We don't. There's no calculation that says put in the CPU processing speed multiplied by 4.1 times the CPU cores multiplied by 5.3 times the amount of cache. No such thing. The only way to tell the difference between one CPU and another is to benchmark it. There's software that you can download to benchmark your CPU, and there are sites like this one, we're going to go take a look at it, that keeps tons and tons of people's benchmarks. I benchmarked all my computers and uploaded them here as well. And that's how they know effectively how fast these CPUs are. So when we look at, and we're going to talk about the project later in a little bit, when we look at, hey, you've got to find the fastest CPU. Fastest CPU does not mean in gigahertz. It means you come to a benchmark page and look up which one's fastest for your computer. So we're going to go ahead and go to this and take a look at, this is at Passmark. We're going to use Passmark for a bunch of other things too. If I go to Passmark, you can see some lists down here. High-end CPUs, mid-range CPUs, low-end, low mid-range, low-end, best value. And so you might be told, hey, find the best value CPU for your home motherboard. You might find the cheapest one for your home motherboard, might find the best one for your home motherboard. So if we go here, I'm going to start at high-end. These all have performance ratings, and the higher number means they did better. So higher is better when we look at these. So right now, the fastest CPU made is made by AMD. It's an AMD EPYC 7763, and it costs $7,890. You and I are probably not going to put that in our gaming PC. Okay? If I want to know more about it, I can click on it, and it tells me more. This is server grade. It's not even a socket we have, so it's not even one we can look at in ours. But there's the highest rating, and you can see it also has, this is the multi-core rating. It also has a single thread rating. So if you've got programs that you want to compare, I want to know how fast this processor works for a single thing, that's what that rating is right there. So this one is not even a socket that is on our list. Let's see if this one is. I'm sure this Threadripper, this is only $5,493. This is an STRX4, so it may be the fastest one. You can see that the clock speed is 2.7 gigahertz, turbo's up to 4.2 gigahertz. It's got 64 cores and 128 threads on that processor. 85,000 rating with a single thread rating of 2628, which is higher than the one we just saw. Is the other one, by the way. And then it has some other information on here. I don't want you to get the information here, I want you to go to the manufacturer's website for most of this stuff because we don't know that this is 100% right. But this is just telling us a little bit about how it came up with the rating on this one, how many ratings it's had on it that have come in, and then where did it find that price at. Newegg's only $5,900 on that one. Okay, so this lets us see that right now, and this goes back and forth all the time. Right now, AMD has the fastest benchmark things all the way down here. Intel's what? Number like 15 on the list, the first Intel one. And this is a Xeon, which means it's a server. Xeons are servers. It probably doesn't even fall into our list. No, it's not even one of our sockets. So let's see that first Intel consumer grade one that we're still looking at Xeons. Here we go. Here's the fastest Intel one. That's for a consumer. Hey, it's only $589. It is a LGA 1700, which is that newest one that just came out. It's got 16 cores, 24 threads. I don't even know how it does that. So some of the cores are hyper-threaded and some of them are not. That is really weird because usually that number is always twice of this one, but it isn't. So it has 8 performance cores that are hyper-threaded and 8 other cores that are not hyper-threaded. And the performance, wow, this is really weird. So the performance cores go at 3.2 gigahertz. The efficiency cores go at 2.4 gigahertz. I've never seen that before. Oh, look at this. Single thread rating is even higher than the AMD. So if I was playing a game on this computer, this one would probably feel far faster than that $5,000 AMD. It only had a single thread rating of 2600. So a single program running on its own thread will run far faster on this one than it would on the other. Okay, let's look at a couple other charts before we move on. So the other chart that I like looking at is this best value on the market chart. This is for every dollar I spend, I get the most CPU points out of it. Okay, so the two best values are this AMD Ryzen 7 1700 and followed immediately behind this Intel Core i3. It's 10th generation i3 right there. This one's only $88. Now, if I was going to buy a CPU, I mean at home with my own money, I'm not saying I would necessarily go to the top thing on here that's the best value, but I might go to the highest number on here that I see that I'm going to get the most value for my money. And when I say that, for instance, if I was going to buy one right now, just from cursory glance at this, I would either be looking at this i7 right here, which has a 32,000 point rating for only $360, or this i5 1200, which is a 26,000. These are both really high ratings, and I know because it's on this chart, I'm getting the most rating for the money that I can. In fact, this one right here, you look on this chart, it's way above everything else on this chart as far as points per dollar. So this looks like for a high-end best value, I probably want to buy this Intel i7 if I had $369. And if I'm buying one at a price point, which we'll be doing on our final project, if I told you, Dylan, that you've got $200 for your CPU, I would just go down here and find the one that's closest to $200 because I know I'm going to get the best CPU for my $200 by going on this chart first and then looking for the thing that's highest under $200. So right here, I could spend $183 for $17,000, $173 for $16,000. That's my best so far. Still better. Still better. Still better. That's my best one. If I had $200 to spend, I would want to buy this Intel Core i5 11/400th be the best for that amount of money that I have. Okay, so that's one of the great things about this chart. I just go and say, this is how much I have. When you guys do your final project, you might get $1,000, and you have to say, okay, I got to buy a case, I got to buy a motherboard, I got to buy memory, I got to buy a CPU, I got to buy a power supply, I got to buy a hard drive. I'm going to buy those 6 things. How do I want to allocate my money? And you might want to go and just say, okay, I'm going to spend this much for this much for this. And then you just go and say, that's the one I want. But this is the chart I would use, the best value, because I'm not saying I go up top, because that's only a rating of 1,400 for $145. And if I had, even if I said I had 150, I'm doing better, only $18 over. Nope, that's probably, if I had 150, that looks like the best I'm going to get. But if I had 200, we just saw I could do much better down there. You have a question on these charts? Okay. Now, in all cases, I got to go and look, because if I went and said that for you, Dylan, and I said, hey, the best value is this Intel Core i5, and your company is AMD, can I use that one? Okay. So I have to go and say, okay, I'm only looking at AMDs now. Which one's my best value for AMD or Intel or whichever company you guys have? Okay. But if it was me at home, and by the way, when you do the final project, there's no tie to AMD or Intel. It's just your money. You build whatever you want to. Okay. Now, traditionally, which one did you have, Dylan? Okay. So traditionally, most students stick with the ones they've done projects on. Because I'm like, I've been looking at Intel the whole year. I'll do Intel, but there's no reason to stick with that. If you went to this and your most important thing was your CPU for you, and you went and did this, and you found out that I could do better if I bought an AMD, then you can switch. You just make sure everything matches. Right? Okay, so that's benchmark pages. You don't have to use CPUbenchmark.net. There are others. I find it to be the most user-friendly, and I like using them. That's a personal choice. On your presentations, and let me go back to that real fast. If you do this one, I expect to see this screen capture on there, so we can actually see the numbers. So when you say, hey, I'm using AMD Ryzen 5 2600X, I want a screen capture of this, so we know what your CPU benchmark rating is, we need to know your single thread rating, and we know this stuff. I don't want you to type it up, just do a screen capture on one of your slides, okay? Okay, so the last thing when it comes to CPU, or the relationship between CPU and motherboard when we think about projects, is the possibility of the bottleneck. I can read the cartoon. Word to the wise Harry, at this morning's meeting you were referred to as the bottleneck. If you don't know what a bottleneck is a term to use to refer to the thing that slows everything else down, okay? And it comes from the fact that if the neck of a bottle is thin, things go through it slower. Okay, so these 2 jars of M&Ms were both turned upside down at the same time, but there's far fewer M&Ms here than here because the neck of the bottle is smaller. Okay, so that's where the term bottleneck or bottlenecking comes from. And we have that happen in computers in that the CPU can do billions of processes a second, but it relies on talking to hardware that can't at all, right? We know that if I hook up this CPU, the most it can do, I'm going to roundhouse the number, this hard drive here, is about 200 million things can go through it in a second, in or out. And if this is going at 200 million, and this is going at 3.2 billion, this slows it down, okay? There are numerous bottlenecks that can happen in a computer by not choosing things relatively well together when we build a PC. So if you buy the fastest processor in the world and pair it with a crappy motherboard that transfers information slow and uses slow memory, you're effectively bottlenecking the CPU and the ability of the CPU. So that it's just a term that I wanted to make sure you understood. But basically, if we can have things, the CPU can be a bottleneck, the GPU can be a bottleneck, the motherboard can be a bottleneck. In general, it's usually the motherboard that's the bottleneck or the memory. Really, the SSD, even that is not as fast with the newest SSDs. So bottlenecks can happen anywhere in our system, but when we build a system, we need to think about all the parts. And if for instance you had $1,000 and you spent $800 of it on a CPU, and then bought a $40 old crappy hard drive, you will have wasted at least $600 on that CPU, because it would have been better spent looking at the whole picture of the system on at least a decent solid state than it would to use this old spinning hard drive, because then your system bottleneck is laid up at the hard drive the whole time. Okay, so I just wanted to bring that back. Now, when we talk about different things, when we talk about whether it's gaming, home, or business, some of the things that we said that I set up as gaming, home, and business don't necessarily mean that can only be used for gaming, home, or business. Okay, so this motherboard right here, I might have had classified in your, oh, this is one of our other ones, but it might have been classified as a home motherboard. But if it can handle the amount of memory that I want, the hard drives I want, and the video card I want, I could easily use it to game with too. Okay, it's just those classifications of home, business, and gamer were just an easy way to limit from low end to high end motherboards by saying the connections and stuff that had to have on it. And when you end up building your system, you could use any of those types as long as they fit within the other parameters of the CPU and stuff you wanted. Okay, you guys already went through these 5 lessons when I couldn't talk the week before Christmas, I think. Yes, you already went through all those. You may or may not have done the CPU project choice yet. So basically, it looks something like this. You're gonna present 2 CPUs, and you can see some of the choices: cheapest home CPU and fastest gamer. Cheapest is right off of Newegg. You don't have to look at the Passmark site to say what is the cheapest. You just go to Newegg, put in your CPU socket type for whatever your home motherboard was, and find the least expensive one you can find that's new, no used ones, on Newegg. Fastest gamer CPU means now I have to look at my gamer socket, and now I go to Passmark and say, what's the fastest one of these that is that socket? And that's the one you want to buy. So you can see cheapest home, fastest business, cheapest business, best value gamer, cheapest gamer, fastest. So in all of these cases, one of them is going to use the Passmark's rating to figure it out. Well, actually, this one, best value home and fastest gamer, those are both Passmark's rating. Best value home and best value, that's both Passmark ratings. Some of them don't use Passmark. All of them use Passmark at least once. So you're going to choose which one you're going to do, and then you're going to have this class and let's see, right, opening. Come on, open. Don't want to do it. You're going to have the rest of this class, and then you're going to have the next 2 classes, and then you're going to present. So you're going to work on the research project on, what is today? Friday. And then on Tuesday and Thursday, you guys are going to present your research projects for this chapter. So let's go through the specifications on the research project, just so you understand. Now, first of all, you're doing the manufacturer that fits your motherboard. So your Intel CPUs and your AMD CPUs, okay? So make sure we follow that. Second of all, you're going to use 2 of the motherboards that you presented on in the motherboard project. So if it says cheapest home, it means you look at your home motherboard presentation and you look at that CPU socket, and that's the one that has to match. Okay, so the big thing here is that we're looking at and making sure the CPUs that we present truly would fit in the motherboards we presented in the last project, because that's part of building, right? If I buy all the parts of the PC and they don't fit together, I didn't buy anything but a pile of junk, right? It all has to work together. So You use those motherboard choices. Nothing can be refurbished. Everything has to be new. In your project, introduction and the background of the company. And now the company is not Gigabyte. It's not Asus. Your company is Intel. You're a representative from Intel. Your company is AMD. You're a representative from AMD, right? So hi, my name is Brian Poole. I'm here from Intel Corporation to present you two CPUs for the motherboards that you previously gave us specifications for. Okay, so when you talk about the background of the company, again, I want to know where the company headquarters is. I'd like a picture of the company. I'd like a picture of a map of where the company is, because we don't all know where your company is. And they're not, in this case, all in Taiwan for the first time. Okay, so you have to present the CPUs that work with your motherboard. So you have to give us a picture of your motherboard again. Hey, you gave us the Asus BTX gaming motherboard. It had a AM4 socket, and here is the AM4 CPU that I'm presenting to you today. So we want to know the CPU's clock speed, how much cache it has, what type of L1, L2, and L3 cache, what socket type, which obviously should match the motherboard, how many processors, and I want to know cores and threads, because remember I said cores are better, threads are, they're important. Having it be dual threaded is good. I want to see that CPU rating for Passmark. I'd like you to give me the screenshot so we can see the CPU rating, both the full rating and the single thread rating. And then I have down anything else noteworthy that you want to tell us about yours. Obviously, how much it costs and where you got it to, with a working link that you can click on and show us where you found that price. And again, I would always take a screenshot of that, save on the back end of your PowerPoint, because if all of a sudden it's not available, you need to show us where you found that price. And it could obviously change. And then finally, a works cited slide in MLA format at the end. It should say works cited. I want to see the full MLA with the website link in your works cited to get full points for that, to show where you got your information. And again, it doesn't have to be PowerPoint. I keep saying the word PowerPoint. It can be PowerPoint, it can be Google Slides, it can be Prezi, whatever your preferred presentation choice is, okay, for that. And then the rubric is down here at the bottom. Hopefully my link works. There we go. And it does. And it has all the information on there. You can see introduction, company background, PC motherboard number 1, so you have to tell us the motherboard name, form factor, memory, CPU socket, to doing, and then tell us about the CPU itself and the stuff on the CPU. Okay. Any questions on that? Okay. I know we did. Is there any questions? CPUs are really kind of easy, I think. The biggest thing people make mistakes on is assuming that gigahertz is everything, and it's not, and making sure the socket matches. And when you look at your motherboard, it should have whatever CPU you're going to use as a listed CPU that works with that motherboard. Again, just because, I don't know if we talked about this back in motherboards, just because it's got the same socket doesn't mean the firmware on the motherboard will work. It has to be a listed CPU that says it'll work. So, questions? Okay, so you got the rest of today, you got Friday, you got Tuesday, and we're going to present on Thursday. Okay.